And so we're working on this demo called DOM elements today. DOM is short for the document object model. Hopefully you guys remember that term from a previous class like MMP 100, or if you've taken maybe MMP 200 or 240. But the document object model is basically just our HTML page. And so the document is the web page, and the object model is the way that we kind of use the web page. It has our buttons and our paragraphs and our divs and all of that other stuff inside of it. And so because most of the code we've been writing this semester is using P5 to create graphics, we really haven't talked much about HTML or CSS. But we are still on a web page, and we can still interact with HTML and CSS. And JavaScript was actually originally designed to work with HTML and CSS. So P5 is fun because we can do visuals and we can talk about design and interaction and animation and things like that. But we can also interact with the browser, interact with our HTML and CSS and databases and other content and stuff like that. So today we're just going to look at a couple simple ways to do that, and we'll integrate it with our pattern project that we've been working on. We can get into it. Let's take a look at, let's open up our P5 project and take a look at our HTML and CSS that we already have. So I'm going to just log into the P5 editor real quick, and I'm going to open up my project from, let's see, I think it's this one from Monday. Oh no, those are the functions. Let's open our button function. Oh, but this is, oh no, sorry, we want to get last week's example. Okay, loops. Nope, where's our pattern? I don't know why. Let's see. Okay, loops plus random. I should have called this pattern. Is this our, yeah, there we go. This is the right one. Okay. So we're gonna add some stuff into here. And so I'm gonna make a duplicate copy of this. I'm gonna make the window a little bit bigger so I can see the code more. And so I'm just gonna duplicate this project. And so we'll call this DOM plus pattern. That should be a little bit easier to find in the future. And so I'll just change this bit up here, DOM plus pattern. And it's November 9th, so I'm just gonna put the date here. And let's see, I'm gonna get rid of this. I don't think we need this here. So we basically just have this setup function, which draws this pattern, and it's doing some other stuff. Like I have these circles in here. I'm gonna get rid of some of this stuff that we don't really need anymore. So let's get rid of these circles. And let's get rid of these green circles down at the bottom. Let's just simplify this a little bit, just so we have our generative pattern. So we have our pattern that, there's some variation, there's some randomness. And so we're gonna add in a couple interface elements so that people can interact with this pattern. So users can interact with the pattern. And so, yeah, we can look at adding stuff into the DOM. So as I mentioned before, we know this is a website, right? Like we have our index.html here, we have our style.css here. So even though we're writing mostly JavaScript, we're still creating a website. And we can use JavaScript to add elements to our website. So I might also look at let's go to the full screen version of this project, so we can take a look at that as well. And over here, we can go to inspect and take a look at our elements as well. So you guys probably remember looking at the elements from MMP 100, hopefully. And just to, as a quick reminder, this is a way of looking at how the document is structured. So this document actually, I forget the P5 is a little bit crazy because it's an embedded document inside of this document. But let's see if we can find, here it is. Okay. So here's our P5 document. It's embedded inside of this um, this other page, which is a little annoying, but you can see here's the HTML, here's the body section, here's the main section with our canvas, and there's our script down here, and there's a couple extra things down here. So we still have HTML that we can look at, and we can add more HTML in here as well. So that's what we're going to look at today. And if you remember from like the very beginning of the semester, we opened up the console and we typed in document, and that showed us, our whole HTML document as it's represented in JavaScript. That's really what I'm talking about when I talk about the document object model. Using JavaScript, we can see everything that makes up this website, and we can manipulate it. We can change the content, we can change the styling, we can add content or remove content. This is the way that we communicate between JavaScript, our scripting language, and HTML and CSS, our markup and styling languages. So let's draw a button first. Let's add a button into the scene. We're just going to create a button using our P5, but it's going to actually add an HTML button. So I have an example here, but we're just going to add it into our P5 scene. So inside the scene right now, I just have a setup function, and then I have this mouse press function to save an image. But actually, I don't really need this. I'm going to turn this off for now, or let's just delete this. We'll replace it with something else later. So now I just have the setup function. And so with the setup function, if I run this, it just draws, my pattern on the canvas. And then after that, nothing else happens because it's just going to run once and it doesn't run again. So we kind of talked about this on Monday, but let's go over it again. If I want to be able to run this more than once, the way I can do that is I can encapsulate my pattern code into another function that is going to be a custom function. So we're going to make our own function to call inside of setup to actually draw our pattern. So I'm going to modify my setup function a little bit. After create canvas, I'm just going to call this function called pattern, which doesn't exist yet. But once I close setup and I'm going to create a new function, I'm going to write function pattern, and I'm just going to conveniently put this at the beginning of my code. And then I'm going to use the old bracket down here that was connected to setup. I'm going to use that as the beginning of my pattern function. So I'm basically taking all the code that was inside of setup and moving it into this new function called pattern, which just draws the pattern for me. So this doesn't change the code at all. You can see when I run the sketch, we get the same thing. But what's happening is I'm calling this function here, and that's calling my function pattern down here. And we can do that more than once. We can call it as many times as we want to. And so that's a good thing to use to create an interface. We can give our user a button to click on to generate a new version of the pattern. So let's do that now. I'm going to collapse the pattern function. We don't actually need to change anything inside of our pattern function quite yet. So let's just stay in our setup function, and we're going to add a button. So if I want to add a button in P5, I need to use a DOM function. So let's go over to the P5 reference real quick and see if we can find stuff about the DOM. So here we go under DOM here in the reference. If we click on that, we'll see all of the functions that are related to our document object model. So there's a bunch of stuff in here. Some of it should look familiar, like create P creates a paragraph, create div creates a basic div, create image, we'll make an image tag, create A, we'll make an anchor tag. So we can create all these different types of HTML elements. And the one that I want to create is a button. So we can see right here, it says create button. So let's click on that. And you can see we can create a button, and that makes an HTML button on the page. And we can actually assign that button to a variable so that we can style it and move it and do different stuff with it. So let's do this in our own example. So I'm just going to start by creating a button. So if I just type in create button by itself, if I just call this function and then run my code, you're going to see there's a blank button down here. And this is actually an HTML button. Right now, the text just says undefined because I didn't give it any text. But if I reload my page over here and I inspect that button, oh, I forgot to save it. Okay, let's save this and then reload it. So there's my button down here. This is not part of my P5 graphics. Notice that it's outside of the P5 canvas. So if I right click on here and go to inspect, you can see this is an HTML button, right? There's my canvas up here inside this main section, and then my button is down here. And so I'm actually creating new HTML. I'm not just adding stuff onto the canvas. So if we created a button inside of our canvas, like last on Monday, we created that little circle that you hover over. That, you could also call a button, but what I'm talking about here is actually a separate HTML button. It's completely outside of our P5 canvas. But we can talk to it using JavaScript. So we can create it inside of JavaScript with our script, and we can tell it what to do as well. So I'm going to give some text to this button. I'm going to say generate new pattern. And so now we have a button that actually has some text on it, but it doesn't have any functionality yet. When I click on this, nothing happens. So we need to assign the button. And then once we assign that button to a variable, we can add an event listener to it. An event listener, well, let's do that first, and then we'll talk about what an event listener is. So I'm going to assign this button to a variable. I'm going to say new pattern button equals create button, generate new pattern. And I'm going to move this over a little bit just for now because it's kind of hard to read like that. There we go. So it's kind of a long line, but we're just saying new pattern button equals create button, generate new pattern. And so this function makes my button. And then by assigning it to this variable, I can continue to do stuff to it. I can add an event listener to it or change the style or do other things. So once I have a reference there, I'm going to say new pattern button. And what I'm going to do is add an event. So let's go and see if P5 will tell us what type of events we can do. So there's one here in the example. It says button.mouse pressed. So that's a good example of an event. Let's see if there's any others. Let's go to button, and it doesn't tell us anything here. Let's see if we can find anything under P5 element. Okay, so under P5 element, we can see some of the different methods or functions that are related to a element. So mouse pressed, whoops, mouse pressed here is an event that will trigger whenever we press the mouse. And double clicked and mouse wheel. So we see there's all these events that are similar to our other P5 events, but now they're associated specifically with just this button. So it's not just if I click anywhere on the canvas, now it's if I click on the button specifically. So we're going to use mouse pressed as our event. And this is basically just going to look for whenever we press the mouse. And when we press the mouse, we're going to give it what's called a callback function. And a callback function is just a function that happens after an event occurs. So in here, I can just put my pattern function. So now, whenever I press the mouse on the new button, it's going to call this pattern function that I've created down here. And that will regenerate a new pattern. So now if I run my sketch and I click on the button, you can see each time I click, we get a new pattern. So I'm going to move this back so we can see the whole canvas. And there we go. Every time I click my button, we get a new pattern. And so this is a convenient way to make a user interface. We have a button now that has very clear text on it and tells the user what to do. And it has all the defaults that an HTML button has. Like if we hover over it, it's kind of hard to see because it's pretty subtle, but when I hover over it, it changes color a little bit. And when I click on it, it changes to another color. And so we can see there's some like built-in styling changes that kind of let us know that this button is doing stuff. So it has its own hover state and active state. Okay, so that is how we generate a button, but we might not want it to look exactly like this. We may want to style it a little bit. We may want to do different stuff with it. So let's keep looking at more things that we can do with this button. This line is very long. I wish there was, let's just call this new pattern. That way it won't be quite as long and we can see more of our sketch here. Okay, that's still pretty clear. It just says new pattern. So when I click on this, it makes a new pattern. Okay, so let's see what else we can do with our DOM. Well, actually, we're going to add a new button first. Okay, so this is actually a good thing to cover. Since we already had this function existing, it was already there, it was pretty easy to plug it in to this new button. But if we didn't already have a function there, we could create one. So let's make another button, and this one will let our user save an image. So I'm going to make a new variable to reference this button, and I'll say save image button. We'll just give that variable a name, and we'll create another button and just call this save image. So that's the text that will appear on the button. And so now I'll do the same thing, save image button dot mouse pressed. And now I don't have a function that already exists, but I can make one. Whatever function I create is what this button will call as my callback function. So I'm just going to invent a function called save image. And so this function doesn't exist. If I ran this code as is, I would get an error. But let's make that function and define what we want to happen. So I'm going to make a new function. So I just have the function keyword and then save image as my function name. And then as usual with the function, I need some parentheses. There's no argument here, so I don't have to put anything inside the parentheses, but I just have some default parentheses. And then my code block, so my two curly brackets to separate my code block. And all I want to do is save this image. So I'm just going to say save, and I'm going to call this pattern.jpg, and that'll let the user save the image to their computer. So now I can click new pattern, and when I get a pattern that I like, I can just click Save Image, and there it downloads into my Downloads folder. So if I go to my File Explorer and go to Downloads, you can see the patterns that I've saved so far. So this is just a JPEG image of the canvas with the pattern drawn on it. So again, I can add to this user interface and let my user know what's possible with the P5 sketch without having to give them specific instructions, like the buttons have the instructions kind of built into them.
Is there a way to like spread the buttons apart or like move them around?
Yeah, we'll add some CSS
Oh, okay.
at some point in a minute. But yeah, we can use styling to do that. Okay, so let's keep going. Okay. So we can also change aspects of our pattern. And so for this one, we can, in this example, I'm like rotating this other pattern. So every time I click new pattern, it also rotates. So we can do other stuff besides just regenerating the button. So we can give users control over other things. So let's give them a button that will randomize. What's something that we can randomize in here pretty easily? Let's see, this size. So well, that's each one is randomized. Um, let's see. What would be easy to randomize? This 100 would be easy to randomize. That's the distance between the parts of my pattern. So let's do that for now, just as an example. It's easy to do there. So if we want that to be different values, we have to make a variable for that. So let's call this uh, our column width. So that's the width of each column. So if it's 10 pixels, we have a ton of columns, and so we make a lot more of our pattern. If it's something larger, then we have fewer. So I'm going to initialize it at 100. And then I'll put column width into our loop. So now we have x plus equals column width. So whatever we set here is how big the columns will be. So this is just an example. You could randomize lots of other stuff like the color or the size or other things, but let's just show this as an example. So I can add another button. So I'll say random column button. And so I'll create another button and say change column width. So I want to, tell the user what this is going to do. And then I'll say random column button equals, or sorry, dot mouse pressed. And so we still need a new function here, right? We don't have a function for this yet. So let's just call this randomize. And so then I'll make this new function, randomize. And I'll just say column width equals random. And we'll do something between, let's say 50 and 200. So that'll give us a random column width. And one thing that we'll notice is I can change the column width, but it doesn't actually update until I click new pattern. So let's actually just draw the pattern as soon as we randomize it. That way we don't have to wait to click the pattern again, the pattern button, to see the difference. So now I'm just going to change the column width and draw a new pattern at the same time. So that gives the user a little bit of control over the column width, but we're not saying exactly what we want the column width to be. So we can give the user control a little bit more specifically with other types of HTML elements. So another thing that we can use is a slider. And so in the example here, I'm adding a slider to the page, and that's updating the rotation of the shapes in this pattern. So if we change our column width value to a slider, we'll actually give the user control over exactly what the column width is. Okay, so let's look at how to do that. So I'm going to comment out this bit for now and change this to a slider. So I'm going to say column slider is create slider. And the slider takes a few different parameters. One is the minimum value. So let's use the minimum value from our randomize. So that's 50. And then the next value is the maximum value. So that's 200. And then there's an optional value, which is how far you go in between. So if we don't put anything here, it'll just be 1. So let's start with that, and then we can update it and see what the other possibilities are. So now we have to add a different type of event for a slider. A slider obviously doesn't get pressed by the mouse, but it does have an input, I think is what it's called. Let's go check actually. So let's look for create slider in our reference. This just tells us the slider.value. This is actually an easier way to do this. You don't have to give it an event because you can just get the value from the event. But there is an event associated with the slider. I think it's just dot input. It might be dot change. Let's see. Well, we could just, yeah, okay, let's just do it the way that they do it in the reference. That'll be a little bit easier. So for this one, we actually need to make this a global variable. We have our column slider here, but if we declare this inside of setup, we won't have a reference to this anymore when we get to our pattern function. So let's take out the var here and make sure this is a global variable. So after column width, I'll say var column slider. And then what I can do, now I don't actually have to attach an event because I can just look at what the value of the column slider is whenever I want to. So now instead of having an event, I can just change the column width every frame. I'll say column width equals column slider dot value. And so dot value just tells me the current value of the slider. So now if I run this, oh, oh it might be dot val. No, it's dot value. Okay, we have an error. Let's see what our error is. Cannot read properties of undefined. Okay, did I spell this wrong? Column slider equals create slider. Okay, let's log. Oh, you know what it is? Okay, this is actually a good thing to go over. This is because I'm calling pattern here at the beginning of setup before I've created my interface. And so what's happening is it's actually going to pattern and trying to get the column slider value before I've actually called the column slider. So this is an important thing to realize with functions is I'm actually running a whole bunch of code when I call this pattern function. And I'm doing it before any of this stuff happens because pattern comes first. So what I need to do to fix this error is make sure that I don't call pattern until after my interface is set up. So I'm going to cut pattern from here and move it down here. And I'll put a note in here, call pattern after interface setup. And let's put a comment here that just says interface setup. And let's call it DOM or HTML interface setup. Okay, so now we shouldn't get that error. So now we have this slider. Oh, but this is why we might want an event, because now if I change the slider, nothing happens. So let's actually add an event to it and just call the pattern function. So I'll say column dot or column slider dot, I think it's input, and then we'll call pattern. So this way, when I change the column slider, it'll still call my pattern. But we'll just get the value from the column slider and assign it to the column width. So now the user can control exactly how wide the column is. So that's not the most exciting thing in the world, but you could give the user control over, the colors, the shapes, all sorts of different stuff with different sliders or different types of inputs. And we might want to give this a label. Let's put something before this. Let's just say create. I think there's a label. Let's go back to our reference and see if we can create a label. Create, or I don't see label. I think span is the closest. Oh, it's not actually in alphabetical order though. Okay, slider, button, check, select, radio. There's a bunch of other stuff in here. We're not going to go over all of these, but if you want other types of HTML elements, you can see if they're in here, or you can just use, where is it? There's one where you can create any type of element and you just tell it what tag you want to use. Oh, down here, create element. So yeah, if you create element, you can actually say what type of tag you want. So like you can create an H5 and then give it some text. So let's create a label that way. And I don't actually need to assign this to a variable because I'm not going to change anything. So I'm going to say create element. I want to create a label and I want to give it the text column width. So this way we know what the slider is for. We can't see it because of the styling, but you can see the text here. So we'll fix the styling in a minute. But yeah, now we can create a label. And if we reload this, let's make sure to save here. If I reload this and we inspect it over here, you can see that it's created a label. And a label is just an HTML element that we want to put before any type of interface that doesn't have, like the button has its own text, but a slider doesn't have its own text. Okay, so there are a bunch of other types of things we can do. Let's do one more and then we're going to move on to styling. So we can also add a text input where somebody can type whatever they want and it'll appear on it'll add it to our sketch. So we can say hello and it appears on here. So let's give the user the ability to add some text in here and then we'll draw that text. So we're going to need to have a reference to the text. So let's make a another variable and call this text. Let's call this name input. We'll let the user add in their name. And so we'll say name input equals create text, or is it input? Let's go back to the reference and check. It's create input. So input is actually what you want to use for text, although it looks like this doesn't update. So not create text, but create input. And I don't think we need to, if I put some text in here, it'll probably just be the placeholder. Yeah, okay. So that's actually useful so people know that they can put their name in there. So we'll say name input and then write name there. And then we can add this into our pattern if we want to. So let's go down to the very bottom of the pattern and let's just add some text in here. So we'll say variable um, name is name input dot value. So we'll get the text that the user has put in there and then we'll draw it on the screen. So we'll say text, we'll get the name, and then we'll use the X position and the Y position, and let's move it down a bit so it's not inside the self-portrait circle. So let's add like 100 here. I think that should be fine. Okay, and then you see name everywhere. Let's actually not tie it to Y. Let's just put it at the bottom of the screen so it's not moving around. So let's say height minus 100. And there we go. We've got the different names and the fill is moving along with the I fill, which is like this code that I wrote up here, which is okay. I actually, it would probably be good. We can just refill RGB. So let's take this fill RGB and put it before we draw our text. So the name will match the color. And so now if I want to write my name in here, if I want to write Jerry, well, now I have to update it. Okay, so let's also add an event listener. Sorry, this is a lot. So we've created the name input, and we'll just do the same thing we did with the column slider. So we'll say name input dot input will call pattern. So this way, whenever we type in our name, it'll update our pattern as well. So if I put Jerry, it's going to update. If I put Jenny in here, it'll update. And now I can change the pattern. I can change the number of columns. And once I get something I like, I can save the image. Okay, so that's not every type of HTML element, but that's a lot of them. And you can see the rest here. So if there's other things you want to use, like you could actually use a color picker and give the user the ability to choose an HTML color that gets shown in your project. So there's a lot of different options for HTML elements that you can add in here. You can add links, you can add radio and select and checkbox, different types of inputs. You can add audio or video, all sorts of different stuff. But let's move on and do some styling. So we can style using JavaScript or we can style using CSS. So let's look at using CSS first, and then we'll come back and we'll do some JavaScript as well. So I'm gonna actually go to my CSS page, which I don't do very often. But let's go over to style.css. There's only a couple styles in here. One is for HTML in the body to take off the margin and padding, pretty basic. And then this style just says canvas display block. That's just so the canvas sits in the right place. So let's style up our elements a little bit. And we can also like style other aspects of our page. Like if I want the body to have a background, let's say it has a white background. So that way I don't have to worry about my theme in P5. I can see what it would look like on a normal website if we change the background to white. Then we can change like the font. I could say like font family Maybe I want a monospace font here. And notice that some of my fonts changed, but not other ones. Buttons have their own default font. And so if I want a button to have a specific font, I have to set it separately. So what I'd have to do is go to say button and then say font family monospace. So now my buttons have the font that I want. If I want the font to be bigger in general, I can go up to the body and say font size. Let's say we want it to be, let's say 20 pixels. Let's just make it a little bit bigger. So notice again, the button doesn't update. So in HTML, if you haven't used UI elements before, like buttons, they have their own styling, which will not, it'll ignore the basic styles that you add for the body section. So we have to repeat this inside of our button. We can say font size 20 pixels, and now everything is matching. Notice the input didn't update. So if I want to make sure the input goes along as well, I can put a comma after button and say input, and now it's going to style both my button and my input. Um, so then if we want to kind of move things around a little bit, I could put some spacing around them. I could say like, margin is maybe let's do 1 EM. That's going to be a lot of spacing. So it's probably more spacing than you need, but you can see there's a little bit more spacing. It's a little bit more readable. We could do a different margin on the top and bottom. So I could do like 0.5 EM. So that'll space it out a little bit differently. So I won't go into like, tons of CSS stuff because that's not really the purpose of the class, but you can see that any CSS that I want to apply here, I can just write directly into the CSS, and that's going to apply to all of my elements. So any button element, any input element, and then the defaults as well, like I'm using for my label here. Um, so yeah, I can style using CSS. Let's see if I did anything else up here. Yeah, there's a few other things that I did here, but that's basically what I want to do. You can see the styling on the button a little bit better this way, but you can change other stuff. Like if I want the border to be a little more visible, I could say border um, is like 2 pix solid, say blue or something like that. Now there's the border is a little bit more visible, but that kind of changes the other basic button stylings. So then you'd have to add them back in. So if you want to style the whole button, originally you can do that, but using the defaults is probably a little bit easier in a lot of cases. So now the styling comes back. Um, So the next thing that we can do is we can actually position our button in the screen. So if we do this, it's going to kind of change the relationship between our sketch canvas and our HTML elements. So I'm going to go back to sketch.js, and you don't really have to do this. In fact, I probably wouldn't do this, but it's just good to go over this. If you wanted your buttons to actually be inside of the canvas, how would you be able to do that? So this, we have to look a little bit more at how our HTML page is actually set up for this, because P5 is adding our canvas into this like main section that exists inside the HTML. So in our HTML, we have this like main section here, and our canvas gets stuck in there, but our buttons do not get stuck in there. So if we want our buttons to go in there, we're gonna have to like assign them in there, or we can take the canvas out and put that somewhere else. We're gonna have to figure out how to put them together in one way or another. So it doesn't matter exactly which way you do it, but you just want them to have the same parent, and then you can start to style them together. So the easy way that I like to do this is to create a separate div for my sketch, and then I can put everything inside there. So I can put the canvas so I can parent everything to my new container. So the way that I can do that, I'm going to go back to index.html, and I'm just going to delete this main HTML. I don't need this anymore. I'm going to make a new div, and I'm going to say div ID equals, well, actually, to do this styling correctly, I need two divs. I need a container div, and inside of that div, I need a sketch div. Because what I want to do ultimately is style my buttons on top of my sketch. And to do that correctly, you have to be able to style a container. You need something that both the sketch and the buttons are inside of to change the styling of. So it's honestly, it's like more complicated than it's worth, but it is something that you may want to do. So let's go over how to do it. So we've got our two divs in here. Let's go back to sketch.js. And so we talked about this once before when we looked at like the miter limit for the stroke for text, which was like way back in like week 4 or something like that. But if we want to change things about our canvas, we have to assign it to a variable. So let's just say variable canvas equals create canvas. And now we can change our canvas parent. We can say canvas.parent is sketch. Okay, so this will actually find that sketch div and parent the canvas to the sketch. So if we save this, it's not going to change anything quite yet, but if we look at this page, what we're going to see different now is if I inspect the canvas, notice now that I've got some HTML that I can work with here. I've got this container and then I've got this sketch in here. So now I can style things that are inside the container relative to the sketch. So now let's put our buttons inside of our container. So I'll just say new pattern button dot parent, and I'll say container. So this will put our button inside the container div. Let's do this with our save image button as well. Save image button dot parent is container. I'm going to leave the other ones alone for now, just so you can see the difference. So far I haven't changed the styling at all, but what I want to do is put these buttons on top of my div. So to do that, I'm going to go back to my CSS, and I'm going to need to say a couple things. I'm going to have to go to the container, and I'm going to have to give it a relative to position. So I'm going to say position is relative. This basically means that I can change the position of things inside of it. So then I'm going to go to, actually, I think that's the only thing I need to do. Let's see. Let's try it, and then if we have to, we'll come back. So now I'll go back to sketch.js, and now I can actually change the position of my button. So I'll say new pattern button dot position, and this just takes an X and Y argument. So let's say I want it to be at 100, 100. Now we can see there's my pattern button on top of my canvas. So they're stuck in together in the same place. So let's actually move this down a bit. Let's move this to like height minus 50. So we'll put it at the bottom of the screen, maybe height minus 80. Okay, and I'll move it over on X. So I'll say X is like 20 or X is 10. It still has the styling, so you can see they're still using the margin here. And you can see the save image button, it hasn't changed anything because I haven't set the position. So if I want to set the position of my save image button, I'll say save image button dot position. And so we're going to want to move this over. So let's start with like 100 on X, and we'll start with the same Y, height minus 80. So now they're lined up, but we're going to have to move this over farther. Let's try 200. That's pretty good. It might be like 180. It doesn't really matter. You can move it where you want to. So this is only if you want your buttons to be kind of integrated into your sketch. You don't have to do it this way. It's just kind of an example if that's something that you wanted to do. But notice that my slider and my text input stay in the same place because I haven't set their parent to the container and I haven't added a position. So let's go back, let's save this and go back and look at our HTML for a second, and then we're almost done. So when I reload this page, now we see our buttons are on top of our canvas, but they're still not actually part of the canvas, they're just overlaid on top. So if we go to the HTML, you can see here's our container, so that has everything inside of it. Here's our sketch, which has our canvas in it. And then because the container is set to position relative, that means I can absolutely position stuff inside of it. And that's what the position function does with my buttons. So here's my first button, and you can see the position is absolute, and the left CSS rule is set according to the first inputs, 10 pixels. And then the top is set to the second input, 320 pixels. So that's how we get the buttons positioned the way that they are. So that's kind of a lot to do that, but if you wanted to do that, this is how you would achieve it. If you don't really care about this, you can just ignore it and have your buttons appear below the canvas. So I think that is everything that we want to cover here. And I linked to this last week as well, but if you want to look at more information about this, there's a tutorial here called Beyond the Canvas, which shows kind of a lot of the same stuff that I just showed, but in a little bit more depth of how to position different things with the HTML canvas using P5 code. So there's a bunch of different stuff in here. If you want to do more with this, if you want to integrate P5 into a website, this is a good resource for learning more on that. All right, so I'm going to save this, and I'll put a link to this in the voice chat. Um, so you guys can see that, and I'll obviously link to it in the video as well. And yeah, for this assignment, you don't have to do everything I just did. That was kind of like a lot of different examples just to kind of show you guys different things that you could do. But for the assignment, you just have to add the buttons that I added at the beginning to change the pattern and to save an image. And then you can add as many more things as you want, but at least one more thing to change something about your pattern. So whether it's inputting text or changing a color or changing a position or size or something like that, giving the user something to change in the pattern so they have some control over the output. That's the basic idea for this assignment. So I'm going to stop here.